everyone. Thank you for coming today, and also thank you, Various Works, for having us here and also for organizing this amazing event. Today we're gonna be discussing how the internet landscape and context have changed from Web 1 to Web 3, and how it's affecting the way artists produce work, and also how organizations show and promote the work of these artists. Just like to give you like a rough idea of the kind of topics that we're going to be discussing this evening. And to start the conversation, I would like to speak about post-internet art, because it's a art form that has been, I guess, has been contested and often misinterpreted. Like when the post is look more as something that refers to the after, but in reality, what Marisa Olson was thinking in 2008 when she coined the term was the post came mostly as a style. So what happens when the internet arrives? Like she kind of illustrates it within modernity, for example, like postmodern art wasn't engaging with what happens after modernity, but what happens after we become aware of modernity and what it's doing to society. So she makes this reference around the term, and I would like to ask both of you if you can talk a little bit about how post-internet art has shaped your work, and if you have a specific definition about it, or if you have another term that you would like to introduce to describe the practice. Okay. Sorry, it's a very complex.
Okay, yeah. Is mine working too?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. I must say, of course, there's this whole discussion about all these frames of post-internet or digital art. For me as a gallerist, that is actually never really very important. And there are also so many different opinions. I keep myself close to the term digital art because I think that's just the broadest aspect. And for me, that post-internet frame had most to do maybe with getting from the internet also into the physical. And that is something, of course, that is really important for me as a gallery, because that offers other opportunities of showing works and also just selling works, which is what I do.
Yeah, that's for me. It's a time frame. It's I was sort of born as an artist in sort of the net art period, which is 90s, which had a very specific artistic movement introducing. This is sort of late from that time. So post-internet was a radical shift in the culture of dealing with the internet in art, which was completely different from the 90s. So it has had a big impact on my own practice, something I've been going right through, and I see Web3 as another one of those. So that is the third, which is, again, drastically impacting my practice. It's kind of funny. I think Rafa Rosendahl said Web3 is truly post-internet. So you can think about that. But but for me, it's their time, the phase of time with certain cultures. You could even put them like Web 1, 2, 3 right next to each other, and they've had dramatic cultural impacts.
But could you explain like more about what then the influence on your practice was?
Yeah, it's following the medium basically, and of course in the 90s it was really projecting ideas onto a novel medium and help shaping it in a way. And of course Web 2 was a ecology from big tech, which had much more focus on content. Literally, the artworks, they wouldn't be creating the infrastructure, but would be filling them, and it really responding to this grown culture. So in the 90s, there wasn't that much culture; it was being created, and post-internet, there was already a whole generation who grew up and brought their whole upbringing and then teenage years into the net. So there was a radical different culture going on, and that shaped a whole new generation of artists, and the old ones like me going through it. And yeah, Web3 again has a whole different shift and brings in a whole new generation and a whole different way of thinking and technology. So those are the big waves, and I think there's a lot more to come. So yeah, but yeah, that's probably all.
I think in general, and also within the context of the BNA collection, we used digital art as an umbrella term to like bring together all of these practices. But I think it's important to consider it because it kind of frames those changes from Web 1, where artists were working with the net, and then within like Web 2, when we have all of these new platforms organizing the way we communicate and also the way like information is distributed. And then when we have now like Web3 and like really like looking into blockchain technologies, crypto economies and NFTs, is interesting to see how also the communities and the values around these different platforms are shifting. And also in terms of that, I was gonna ask you about the values or also the behaviors that you have seen maybe within your audiences in terms of like when you start showing your work from the first time to now, like how they have changed within all of these technological and social frameworks.
I think that is now really changing. Of course, the whole hype of around NFTs also changed a lot. Brought like a broader digital art movement to a much broader audience. At the same time, maybe that sort of framing or really putting it time, as you say, is more important than ever in a way, because I also remember that like a few years ago we were at Art Basel and we did a presentation of the early works of Jody, the artist collective that since 1995 have been leading figures in the net art scene. And one of the most asked questions with all those like very, very early software works was, is this an NFT? No, it's not an NFT, and there's a world before the NFT. So that's also a change that we saw, like a much broader audience, but also an audience that hardly knows that there is something before the NFT.
Yeah.
Reframe the question again. Was the audiences?
Like how the audience have like shifted their values or behaviors from Web 1 to 3.
Funny, weirdly enough, I mean, all three are radically different, but it seems I have a feeling that it does feel like Web 3 does feel like a reboot of Web 1 in a way, which is kind of fascinating, but with an old, completely unique character. But it's of course the fact that the technology of it's sort of reminiscent of Web 1, so it's something new, it's decentralized, it works outside the institutions, where Web 2 was all about institutions. So it really is it's sort of anti-institutional and underground again in a way that Web 1 was, but then it's completely different, of course, and it brings a whole new generation. But for me, I think it's fantastic because it does sort of. It is also a reintroduction of net art, and something that was sort of getting lost with post-internet. It was literally colleagues of mine were saying, "So net art is dead, and you're still making that," and it's like it really was sort of out of vogue in a way, and it wasn't the focal point. And it's completely back in a way because there is a native carrier of this kind of work, and a whole new audience interested. So. Yeah, I find that impressive. So my work has sort of revisited the whole sort of pure net art, and it's found its audience. So you could say, like in the 90s, it was the front runner group, a bunch of artists, handful of curators, handful of theorists, and they would all know each other, and that was it. And the rest of the world was in oblivion of what was going on. You have that, of course, with NFTs as well, but it's a much bigger base, and it's there really is a community that is dedicated to this kind of work, and is very knowledgeable, in fact. So they're definitely not unaware of anything before NFTs. It's a very knowledgeable community. So that's pretty amazing, to be honest. I find that really rewarding.
And in terms of the physicality of your works, because you bring some of these elements from the net into the physical space through sculptures and on the installations work that you have been doing. So I was wondering how that changed your relationship with the audience.
Yeah, it's sort of drifting apart a bit, not completely, but that is something for the future to say. I think NFTs, there's a lot of talk about digital, it's a horrific word, and I don't really commit to that yet. I don't see the value of that completely. I think I really value the digital native aspects, because I think that is what the crypto art is bringing to us. It's this carrier which can support this. But great, it's going to be explored, and but I think it's great that parallel to that, sort of in the gallery context, you can show your physical works together. They can add to each other in the narrative, and so I think it's a win, a plus thing.
And I also want to ask you, Nieck, in terms of curating and also like working with different artists and doing the programming for the gallery, like how these technological changes or like the way that we interact with art have affected that, because you have worked with artists like Jody, but you also work with artists like Jan and Harman the Doppel. So it would be good to understand how these circumstances frame a little bit the way you think around artists, promotion, exhibition.
I don't know if I exactly understand your question, but well, first of all, I select my selection of artists is purely based on my intuition and what I find really interesting and what I would collect myself. Like actually, I'm in the first place a collector maybe, and then a gallerist. So that is how I select. Maybe I take a totally different direction because I just don't know if I understood your question correct. But what I saw within the movement, especially with the hype around NFTs, was really interesting for me, because I was working with artists like indeed Harm van den Dorpel, for example, especially, and Constant Dullard also, who were already working with the concept of NFTs, I think from around 2015, something there. And I had really no idea what they were talking about. It was also a time that they also couldn't really explain it to me. Like there was just a barrier in that communication. And so at that time I said, because they were coming to me and saying things like, hey, I have this work, we can sell it with an NFT. And then I said, yeah, but what does that mean? How does that work? And that was, I couldn't get that really clear. So I said to them, let's not do it, because I don't fully understand it. And then I can't explain it to my clients, and it's a bridge too far. And then, of course, this hype came, and then it all went fast. But what I did was to take 2 steps back, because that is my role as a gallery, actually, to build reputations, careers very gradually, and to try to get the prices up, but in like normal steps. And what happened there was, of course, like totally crazy. That was very clear to everyone. Raphael Rosendahl was making lots of money right away. But we also had daily talks then, like, what is happening here? This is totally crazy. And it has nothing to do with like the real world. But also because it all developed so fast, I think within 1 or 2 months time, I also figured out that like it didn't change anything actually for me and for my role. The role was just the same. Curate really good works and work with good artists and give them a platform, and like, yeah, of course, then also like ask normal prices for the works they are making, and then what happens after, yeah, that's not in my hand. But the same is with physical artworks. When a painter gets really popular and goes to auction, that's also something you can't control anymore. So it wasn't that different. Yeah.
And maybe we can go 10 years back in time.
Yeah.
And consider like some of the motivations that led you to work with artists that were very engaged with internet or internet culture.
Yeah.
And also, it will be great to hear a little bit about the scene back then in Amsterdam and how it has like evolved into the present moment, or how you have been like the evolution of the interest of people in digital art practices.
Yeah, so indeed, I founded my gallery around 20 years ago, and it has always been my goal to have an international gallery with like an international program and dealing on the international market. It was always a very broad program, ranging from paintings to video to sculptures to performance. At that time, digital art was not a part of that. But I think around 10 years ago, 12 years ago, one of my collectors started to pull my jacket and said like, hey, you have to look at these websites of Raphael Roosendaal. Raphael Roosendaal made websites as unique art pieces. He had bought a couple, and he was showing me on every occasion his websites on his phone, like, this is so cool, you should look into this. And I must say at that moment I didn't really get it immediately. I thought like, yeah, it's nice, but I don't know what to do with it. And I had to make a group exhibition at a certain moment with on the topic light. Very broad topic, so I couldn't bring anything in. And I thought about these websites of Raphael, and I thought like, hey, this might be interesting, you know, let's see what he has done with that topic, maybe with his websites, and that is actually interesting. And then Raphael came with something different. He said, well, I just made these new works, physical works, and they are lenticular paintings. And lenticular paintings is the technique of, you know, from these postcards, you wiggle them and you see movement. And Raphael made big works with them, with abstract compositions. And I immediately loved those works, but what it especially did for me was that I thought that, oh, this is really smart actually, because it's a sort of a bridge between like this physical art world that, as more traditional galleries we all know very well, and that digital world that I didn't know so much about. And so the work is installed like a painting. It looks like a painting, but at the same time it glows like a screen because it functions with lenses. And it's interactive with you as a viewer. So if you walk by, you see like the stuff change. And I thought that was incredibly smart. So I took that work in my exhibition, also with a website, and then it really started to live for me. And then I started to dive into it, to study the material, and I found out, of course, like how important this whole movement actually is, and especially also the role of Dutch artists within this whole movement. And I saw the enormous potential, and I've always been very interested in radical things, and I see this also, so this whole movement around digital art, especially since like the start of net art, I see that as a really radical turnaround within contemporary art. I've been always jealous to colleagues that were already working in the 60s and 70s, because then we had a turn to conceptual art, which is another major radical change in thinking about art and looking at art. And I saw that radicality also within this digital art movement, and that really interested me. And yeah, then I just went full force for it. So I still have a very broad program. I still also bring painters or conceptual artists from the 70s, but I also bring this like newer movement. Yeah, and yeah, I think the most interesting is indeed that I see that it's finally a radical turnaround again in contemporary art. So for me, it's really like 60s, 70s conceptual art, then around about 40, 50 years, almost nothing. Of course, great works have been made, but no real radical turn. And then you have this radical turn again. And now also, especially with generative art, I see that also. Like, because that is just an art form that really completely changes how we look at art, how we have to write about art, think about art. So that is what is really interesting to me, and the feeling that you are part of something in which you can write art history. That's very tempting to me.
Yeah, in that respect, I feel very lucky to be working with the B&A Digital Art Collection, because we have works from 1952 with people experimented with electronic systems.
Yeah.
And you can see also the conversations between them and conceptual artists or artists very interesting in op and kinetic art. So it's interesting to see those links and then recognize it like 60 years now that's becoming a new movement. Like those artists have set the grounds from what we have now.
Yeah.
And I was also wondering, Jan, like in terms of your artistic practice, like how did you see this landscape moving from the 90s into the present and the art scene within Amsterdam as well, if you can talk a little bit about that.
That's difficult. I wasn't around that long, of course. Yeah, as I said, I went through the different movements within net art. I'm trained as, I did architecture first, and I was trained as a sculptor at the Art Academy. Hence Leila's comment about me making internet sculpture, which is true. So that is my background. So at the Art Academy, I sort of connected to the internet and committed myself to this as a new medium. And that's when I got into contact with a sort of rich community within the Netherlands. There was like Martina Nedam, Mouchet, and Deborah Solomon, The Living, and Peter Leuning, and Jodi, and so there was a very living community of very active net artists. So that was great. So they were my teachers in a way. It was when I was sort of embarking on this journey, and then then going on. So you probably saw the scroll bar coming past in the gallery space, which is a work I made in 2002. So it was. I remember then when I started making net art, sort of end of the 90s, it was such a vacuum still. So there was absolutely so little people engaging with it, and I remember getting just feedback from people who would just consider it crash art or hack art, and I was like, no, it's not at all. It's composed, very aesthetic, formal work actually, and but it's just people would see it and it looked like a weird screen and they couldn't interact with it. So it was like glitch art. So very frustrating that was. So and that was just people didn't have more attention than 3 seconds and saw it as a very functional surrounding. So I shifted my attention to the gallery space to put like the scroll bar you said in this gallery space, because the attention there is very different and people would engage and see it as sculpture. So that worked really well, and because I was doing that, there was this new generation of artists, the future post-internet artists, who picked up on that and found that also very interesting, and that's when Harm van der Dorpel and Constant Dullaar and Katja Novickova and people like that would knocked on my door and pulled me into this new movement, which was very fascinating. So that was, and that's also a very active group in Amsterdam. It was a great scene, and that's sort of briefly the story.
Thank you. And also in terms of the internet, you work with it as a material almost. So I was wondering what drags you into certain elements, or like how do you find like some elements from the design of the internet like more appealing than others?
Like
yes, like that one, and the scroll bars. Like what really drags you into these elements, and then how do you conceive taking them into the physical?
Yeah, that's cool. I'll just briefly tell. So I did do architecture first. Was great. Had a great time. But way too complex for me. Way too applied. Way too layered. I have a focused, small brain. I need to sort of concentrate in one point. So not my field. But I had a very sort of philosophical interest in the relation between the body and the space. A phenomenological interest in what's going on. So I did that. That sort of left a mark on me. So when I went to the art academy, the first thing I would do was enroll in sculpture and experiment with installations and performances, which in a way is sort of autonomous architecture. And that was great. So I had a lovely time, and could have gone on with that. But it did feel like, yeah, the 60s, 70s, there'd been so much groundwork there, so it was like, it's not the edge I'm looking for. And that is when I ran into the early internet. So that's 95-6 at the art school. I was very lucky to be in an art school where they actually had some knowledge walking around, which is unimaginable because I'd been teaching 15 years after that and I never really found it. So always been worked against, as art academies never were interested in net art or any practices. But back then there was just one or two teachers walking around, so I think that was destiny. And they pointed at people like Jody, and I was like, holy shit, this is fascinating. And it was this, it sounds cliche, but sorry, the mic seems to be, it's back. I had this magical moment when I uploaded my first file as a student in my student house, and sort of an HTML experiment. That's only when it really clicked. So before that it was like, I'm fooling around on my computer, but when I just dragged this file to a web server and could observe it in the worldwide habitat it was, and it just gained this extra materiality. It's like, suddenly it's like, it's a draft of something and it becomes a building. So it's like this architectural step. And it becomes a part of community internationally. It's an interactive medium. It's something you evoke through code, which I find fascinatingly different than anything else. So that means it's sort of, you invoke, it's like, you formulate what it's going to be, and then it's executed as material. And of course, a lot of the materials are sort of, they're called objects in programming language. It says a lot. So you have like a scroll bar object or all these button objects. So there's a very logical association for me to see it as a sculptural exercise. So I see it as an expanded field of sculpture, the internet of the browser-based context. That's how I started working with it. And that also, I think, informed my choices. So I'm really focused on the materiality of the experience of the screen. So the windows, this is a JPEG, so I'm not so much interested in the contents of a JPEG, what it's made for, but the JPEG itself. So in this case, it's the compression and the codec. And I can go deeply into this, but that is an example, or the scroll bars you just saw passing by, but also the work upstairs, which is the mountains and drop shadows. It's also like it's a dedication to the desktop in a way, the desktop image versus the materiality of the files and the drop shadows, and I see this as basically wonderful installations, and it is sort of my vantage point.
Yeah, thank you. And I have one last question before we open the Q&A with the audience. And I also don't know if you have any questions or any points that you want to, bring out now.
Well, I wanted to ask you actually. In the Netherlands, I see still a lack of through dedicated digital curators in the museum scene.
Yeah.
And here in London, you see that more. You are curator of digital art. So how do you see that? And maybe you can tell something about how that like developed within the London museums.
Yeah. I actually feel like we have a very wide ecology of galleries, like independent projects, organizations and institutions like looking into digital art. Like we have, for example, here Rebecca Edwards from Arreola Gallery, like also, like Burst Project is another example, like Serpentine galleries are also doing a lot of research into digital art and also like digital legal contexts. And I have seen like more projects like coming together but I also think during the pandemic a lot of the more independent scene died a little bit with the rise of the NFT like hype and also with like the interest of people going into the virtual environments or like want to have more virtual dedicated spaces that have a lot of more physicality. Like I saw a lot of smaller projects died a little bit, but I feel like because the UK has a very strong conceptual context attached to these technologies. Like I'm doing at the moment a project funded by the Paul Mellon Centre around British digital art or digital art in Britain, like really looking into the context or what makes Britain like such a rich digital art scene, and really like is the links into the post-war time and how those technologies were applied into into society here. So like society were like really interesting in the effects of some of these technologies. Like for example, the fact that cybernetics was founded as a field in the late 40s, like really that brought the idea of the effect of technology like and what it did to society back then. And also with the show Cybernetic Serendipity that was curated by Jesha Reichardt in 1968 at the ICA, that really like kicked the idea of people here that actually like digital art can happen. Like there were all of these artists, and I have spoke with very early generation artists that are in their late 70s, early 80s, and they all said like when I saw Cybernetic Serendipity, like even people that didn't attend the show but like saw some of the brochures and just the fact that this was happening, they felt like there was a community and they could do something around it. And we have, for example, also the Computer Art Society that was founded by Alan Sutcliffe, which was a composer, John Lansot was an architect, and George Mallon, who was a cybernetician, that really had an impact into the scene and the community that we have now, because they started to make like computers available. They had a terminal so artists could experiment with computers, because also like thinking back in the late 60s, early 70s, it was very hard to get access to these technologies. You had to work in a lab or you have to work for a corporation, and a lot of these artists were working overnight. When the scientists went home, like they will come and work with all of this technology. And I think that framework and that interest and the fact that was like very present in society. And I also think, I'm from Mexico City, so also like coming to that society that is very analog in a way. Like when I came to study here in 2015, I really see how people use the technology here and how they're very conscious about it. I think it has certain effects on the way they want to experience digital art or what they're looking to see when they go to galleries, to museums, to institutions. Like people really want to see that engage between the digital and the physical.
Yeah.
I think like definitely, and also the international exchange that happens here in the UK with a lot of people coming to study here or to do artist residencies and different practices. Like that international exchange like really has made a difference, and you can see that again like from the 60s to the 70s and how people were trying to create global movements around these practices. So I think like there's a lot going on. Like if anything, like what we need more is like budget and the time to like go and see all of these projects and realize all of the ideas.
Okay, thank you.
I'm gonna have a look because I got into our conversation, but I also don't know if at this moment like someone has a question that they want to bring up. Okay, I'll come back to you.
Yes. I would love to know from your perspective as a gallerist what kind of art you're actually looking for nowadays and how you see it transforming over the next, let's say, 2 to 5 years in the space.
So I think I'm always looking, what I explained earlier, for a sort of radicality in work. But that's of course a very broad subject. What I always select on is also that, of course, I have to like something visually, but also conceptually it has to be really interesting. Like sort of visually stunning but conceptually poor is really not appealing to me. And unfortunately we see that a lot in the commercial art world, but that's just not my cup of tea. So a combination of those aspects actually. But then of course I never know what I'm searching for myself, which is part of the fun.
So actually, just sorry to quickly follow up, how do you source artworks then? What, you say you don't know what you're looking for, so how do you stumble upon this kind of stuff?
Because I'm of course obsessively looking around always as a collector. And that then goes together with my job as a gallerist. So I don't know, I go to academies, I go to art fairs, I see shows in bigger and smaller institutes. Because I have an international program, I also travel a lot, so I come abroad and see things there. And then of course, when your gallery exists some longer, like mine, last week it was 20 years, then a lot of things come to you through your network. So especially the artists that I already work with, they often tell me like, hey, you have to look into this artist, you have to look into that artist. Same for collectors that I work with and have long standing relationships with. They point me out on things. That's the way it goes. Like, of course, we all also get like 10, 20, 30 emails a week from artists that would be represented by us. But that's something, we just don't have the time also to look into it. But that's not the way it works. It really comes on your path through your own network or just your own research. And of course, nowadays, also just simple things like Instagram and things like that. Yeah, I mean, I must say it has become far less interesting than like maybe the first years that we worked with that. But that's still also an important sort of visual source to see what I find interesting or what's next maybe.
Any other questions?
I have a question for Jan, actually. I was wondering if, there's a certain, obviously 2002, like scroll bar, we looked at, there's a certain nostalgia that transpires in that, right? So there's a kind of a movement, like if you look at, I don't know how familiar, but if you look at the interface for like Curve 5, which is a DeX, right? You kind of see also this kind of like nostalgia for when web pages look the way they did like 20 years ago, right? And do you see that evolving as the web evolves, and then we'll have, let's say, kind of AR stuff now, right? With the new, with the set from Apple coming out and sort of like the sunglasses and things like that, right? So those things aren't like not necessarily even being on the screen anymore. Like this is like, for instance, the screensaver, the most recent one, which is like something that maybe comes with a screen still, right? There's no screen anymore. But do you see that? Do you see those tracking that evolution, or would you say that you kind of like have a preferred period within the evolution, this within this visual range over time?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It does totally make sense. I think yes, both is true. This work, for instance, it's called Scrollbar Composition. It's from 2000. It's an HTML JavaScript work. So it's a composition, I would say, winking at modernist tradition, and it's a very material work. So it's a composition of frames with certain background colors and JavaScript animated scroll bars. So scroll bars, everybody knows how you navigate through a page. So what it's doing, it's showing an element of the interface. And this work has been shape-shifting over 20 more years, nearly 25 years. So when I first made it, it looked Windows 98. And then, well, it's, of course, it depends on what you watch it on, how you see it, but also when you see it. I've been trying and watch this piece. This piece actually taught me what digital materiality is, and that it's a transformative, fluid stuff, and it isn't a fixed thing. That goes for pretty much everything working in digital. So this piece, I'm super curious to see how it will evolve into virtual reality context, etc. There will be browsers you can throw up in that space. What kind of software will be run there? Will the scrollbar still function? Will this work just go silent in the future and just be a silent composition? And that's all good, because that is part of the work. So the work is just mirroring the technology in a way. So this work is very agnostic. It doesn't have any nostalgia in it. It's just what it is. The scrollbar you saw was from 2002. That actually was Windows I was sort of still working with back in the time. But sort of recent NFT series I have been, like Ornament, I don't have that one up here, but this one, for instance, these drawings are pretty recent. They're definitely referencing a certain interface aesthetics from a past time. But yeah, that is partly because I've been working with this subject for nearly 25 years. And a big part of it is my personal memory and ongoing relationship with this material and its transformations. And in this case, it's this very fundamental element of that type of interface. So a drop shadow, but this sort of highlighting, which is, in the case of the drawing, it's about the performative action of clicking, of drawing, the whole history of trompe-l'œil. I mean, I do often sort of refer back to something historical, but that again refers back to something hundreds of years ago. So it's always that play. And I try not to sort of really make work on the hype of the moments, like, getting the scoop of the tech of this moment. I find that not very interesting. So I do sort of go in and out of history and different strategies. You're welcome.
We have time for one last question, but I don't know if anyone has another question.
Thank you for the talk. My question's about, you talk about the visible internet infrastructure, so a lot of like UI, UX, and I'm wondering if there's any aspect of your practice which looks into the sort of hidden internet infrastructure, so like data centers or things that aren't necessarily visible on the browser.
Again, a very good question. To be honest, no, but that is, I'm very aware of it, I'm very interested in it, but I'm really treating this experience of software as a very phenomenological one, and I find the substance of software, the running execution of code, the thing we interact with every day, countless hours, deeply mystifying and intriguing. And it's that which I'm trying to sort of create an ontology for. So I'm aware of all the hardware behind it, but I think I sort of get and understand, and I focus my work specifically on software.
Okay, I'm gonna close the conversation because there's people already waiting for the next one. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Nieck and Jean-Robert, for being here from Amsterdam.